So we've already had our first customer. Hey there, my name's Chris and welcome to the acreage. Today on Zen Armageddon, you get to see me suffer in the heat again. The beginning part of this week was, again, silly hot, and I insisted on coming out here and gave myself heat stroke. But the latter part of the week, it's actually been much better. The temperature has been much lower in the morning, and the daytime high is not nearly as insufferable. The humidity is lower. That's not to say that I didn't get hot anyway, but I was able to get a fair bit done. The main things that I wanted to get done this week is to start working on the driveway a little bit more, start building some infrastructure so that way I can deal with the heat when it happens, and get the mosquito traps in. The trap was originally developed by a friend of mine who was a professor at the local university. He was a chemist and he was working on the different mechanisms that mosquitoes used to identify locations to lay their eggs and find humans, and just the whole life cycle of mosquitoes from a sensory perspective. And along the way, he took some information from a literature review to build what are called ovi traps. And ovi traps are basically just a puddle of water where the mosquito would lay their eggs, that then a researcher could collect the eggs. He made it slightly larger, not unlike the bin that we're going to be using today. And he quickly found that the traps could bring in a lot of mosquitoes, and that over time, the number of mosquitoes in that location decreased because you're taking mosquitoes out of the population. And when he was doing sort of the efficacy research of how well does this trap work, is there any special things that you need to do, locations, density, all that sort of thing, I realized that, hey, you can make this thing automatic, so that way you don't have to tend to it as an owner. You could just set and forget. But today I'm going to be showing you the manual version, because for me it makes the most sense to buy and install these, because they work best in volume, in quantity, and to buy all the materials that you would need for an automatic version, it would just be prohibitively expensive. Meanwhile, the traps that I'm showing you how to build today, on the order of 15 bucks. These are not what you would consider an instant trap. You're not going to set them out and suddenly the mosquitoes disappear. Rather, they are designed to interrupt the life cycle of the mosquito. So as the mosquito goes through its life, it is born as a mosquito, comes out of the water, goes, finds a meal, bites that animal, person, whatever, and then lays some eggs in a location that it thinks is an ideal one. And then the eggs hatch, it goes through multiple stages of larva, and then the cycle repeats. So the ovi trap works on the principle of creating the ideal location for a mosquito to lay its eggs. And a mosquito is looking for several things, one of which is that there's no predators. So it's really important that you don't use water that has had fish in it, because the smell of the fish will tell the mosquito, don't lay your eggs here, they're going to die. Second, you don't want to use chlorinated water, because the chlorine will inhibit any bacterial growth within the water, which is actually one of the indicators that the mosquito is looking for. So you should use rainwater or tap water that has had ample time to sit and dechlorinate. And you add two things. You add rabbit chow, which is an organic material. It's designed to break down and become food for the larva. And the other thing is yeast. And that yeast accelerates the breakdown of the rabbit chow, and it also gives off some carbon dioxide to say, hey, there's stuff rotting here. This is a really good place to lay your eggs. But every time a mosquito lays its eggs in the trap and you filter it out, that's 200 to 300 mosquitoes that are no longer in your environment. And if you've ever been anywhere with lots of mosquitoes, you know there can be millions and millions of mosquitoes. And that's why it takes so long to get rid of mosquitoes, because that large population is going to be laying its eggs everywhere, and you have to deplete it. Every time a set of eggs hatches in it, it releases a pheromone that says, hey, this is a really great place to to hatch your eggs. You're going to survive here. And so more mosquitoes lay their eggs. You filter it, eggs hatch, even better, and so on and so on and so on. And more mosquitoes are going to be preferentially laying in your traps. And every time you filter them, you destroy all of those mosquitoes. So what we found was the ideal number of traps is about 3 per acre. You don't have to have that many, and you can certainly have more. What matters most is that you maintain the trap, and maintaining the trap is making sure that you filter that water at least once every 7 to 10 days, depending on how hot it is. As I said before, you want to make sure that you have the eggs hatching because that releases a pheromone. But at the same time, if you leave the water unfiltered for too long, that perfect breeding ground is a perfect breeding ground, and you will actually amplify the number of mosquitoes that you are going to get in an environment. So the system that I'm showing you today is a manual system. It is simple, it is cheap, and it works. But you absolutely must filter it every 7 to 10 days. Because if you don't, you're going to have a very bad mosquito problem on your hands. Filtering it is fairly straightforward. All you do is take the trap and you pour it through a filter. How you do that doesn't really matter. We used pool filters because they're relatively high volume and we could buy them in bulk for relatively cheap. But you can buy those just about anywhere. The trap is really simple. I designed this particular version to be as cheap as possible, but you don't necessarily have to buy exactly what I did because the general principle is the same regardless of the materials used. I went to the Blue hardware store and bought some relatively inexpensive bins. They're actually a little larger than they needed to be, but they were the cheapest ones they had. They were $11 each. So we have a container. Generally speaking, you don't want rain to fall into this because it'll just overflow and it'll dilute the solution and it won't work nearly as well. So you want one that has a lid on it. And beyond that, the volume has to be relatively high. You want to have 3 to 4 inches of water at least, and then not too deep. You don't want to have a foot of water. Mosquitoes are generally speaking looking for relatively shallow pools because they tend to have less life in them, at least the kind of life that is going to be eating their larvae. The bin should also be black because that allows the sun to hit it to warm up the water that's in the bin. Mosquitoes prefer laying their eggs in warmer water. So once you have the bin, you put holes in the side. I put holes on 3 sides because it was shown that light reflecting from the moon and other things can also be one of the attractants that might bring the mosquitoes in. So you want to have the ability to have reflections and just generally speaking, be able to have an easy pass in and out of the adult mosquito. I bought some rabbit chow and yeast on Amazon, but you can actually buy those ingredients at pet supply stores, especially ones that are agricultural. There's a specific yeast, I'll put the name below, that is the ideal one, and they often give it to horses as a nutritional supplement. Those 2 ingredients are combined 4-to-1, 4 rabbit chow, 1 yeast, into a little ball in some nylons. They can be cheap nylons, garbage nylons, it doesn't really matter. The idea is it's a light mesh that contains the ingredients. So that way when you filter the trap, it's really easy to remove and put back in because you want to just leave it there to ferment with time. And then you put water in it. For the bins that I have, 5 gallons was about enough. And I dropped in one of the bait balls. You keep the lid on to keep the rain out. Now, you have to understand, this water is going to stink. You don't want to get it on yourself, not because it's going to hurt you. It's absolutely and completely non-toxic. It's just gross and it smells. So you take relatively clean water that didn't have fish and doesn't have chlorine, and you put it into the bin. That's it. Now it's a waiting game. It takes somewhere between 7 to 10 days for the traps to really start producing. And you can actually look in them and see the egg rafts that the mosquitoes laid. That lets you know that it's working. And after you see your first one, you want to filter it within 10 days if it's below 20 C, and 7 days if it's above 30, and a gradation in between. So generally speaking, if you're unsure, filter them every 7 days and you'll be fine. And then every time you cycle them, they will get more and more effective. Mosquitoes don't actually travel that far as adults. From what the literature review said, it was 50 to 75 meters, at least in normal average conditions. And so if you have these traps, you can lower the local population. And it'll take time for the wild population that's off in the wilds out there to work their way back in. But as they do slowly, they'll start laying their eggs in your traps. You filter them, they're gone. So now that the traps are in, you want to make sure that you have them in place and you keep them filtered and clean of larvae for the entire season, and then just a little bit. You don't want to leave water in it when it freezes. You want to make sure there's as few mosquitoes able to lay eggs to overwinter as possible. So you're going to push it past the traditional mosquito season. In Northern Ontario, that's mid-September-ish. And so what that does is decrease the number of mosquitoes that are going to be overwintering. Fewer mosquitoes are going to hatch in the spring. And you want to make sure your traps are out waiting for them when they do hatch. Because when they hatch, they get themselves a blood meal, and they're going to lay their eggs. If your traps are there, now the trap effect will be much, much more dramatic. Because a single female mosquito, at least Culex, can lay up to 300 eggs. And those 300 eggs will hatch, potentially causing an exponential explosion. And that's normally what you see in Northern Ontario, is you see a few mosquitoes, then the next week there's a few more mosquitoes, and then suddenly they are everywhere, dense and thick. But we've been using these traps at my parents-in-law's place now for almost 15 years. And other than the mosquitoes that blow in windstorms, we really don't have that many mosquitoes. They still exist. It's not perfect, but it does dramatically impact the local population. The things that they normally tell you to do, like make sure there's no standing water and those sorts of things, making sure that there's no other breeding locations on your property, is also going to help. So as I said, these traps are different. They are simple, they're manual, and they are not going to immediately decimate your local mosquito population. And you don't really want to either, because they are part of the ecosystem. They are a food source for all sorts of other things in the environment. What you want to do is locally diminish them. The other kinds of traps do have an effect. If you use Thermacell, for example, that's a repellent. It can have an influence on the local mosquito population. And if you're using the traps that I'm showing you how to make, it will work even better because there's that many fewer mosquitoes to begin with. A mosquito magnet is not something I would ever recommend. When we were designing the traps, one of the things that we joked was the best place to put a mosquito magnet was in your neighbor's yard, because they work by simulating a human sitting there in your backyard, and it attracts all the mosquitoes. And you hope they get sucked into the fan of the trap that will then theoretically decrease the mosquito population, but it just tends to bring a whole pile of mosquitoes into your local area. And if any of those mosquitoes find you, they'll bite you, and then they're not going to go for the trap anymore. They're going to go lay their eggs and just propagate the problem. And that's why we designed the system we did. It interrupts that life cycle. It's completely environmentally friendly. And if you remove the traps, the effect goes away. You can pour the water out and it doesn't affect anything. Even if your dog drinks it, well, again, it'll be gross, but it doesn't really matter. And one of the things that we noticed when we were initially testing it is if the solution was too strong, the bears sometimes took interest and they would basically destroy the trap out of their curiosity. So they would flip it open or knock it over, and the water would run out and then it wouldn't work anymore. But very quickly, in most of the locations where that happened, the bears would trash them the first couple of weeks they were out there, and then they would ignore them after that because it's not really edible for them anyways. There's no interest, there's no food, there's no fun, there's just this thing that is there. So if you do have one destroyed, it doesn't really matter. So the overall cost is relative. Like I said, the bins themselves were $11. The ingredients, the more you can buy, the cheaper it is. I paid about, I think it was $12 for the ingredients, but those were enough ingredients probably to last me 5 or 6 years with 20 of these traps. I'm going to be putting them out in several locations in the core, so that way around where the sheds are, around the house site, and anywhere else where I might want to spend a lot of time. But I'm not going to be trying to treat the whole 220 acres, and I'm certainly not even going to try to treat the whole core. Because that effect is so local, I'm basically going to put a perimeter of traps around the area that I don't want to have the mosquitoes in, and that's it. I might use a thermocell sometimes. When it's a windy day, well, you're going to have to suffer the consequences, but again, within a few days, they'll go away. And it's just simple. You could automate these if you wanted. I mean, technically the patent's out there. I think it's even expired now, so you can go and do whatever you need to do. The thing that made our trap patentable was that we had an automatic system. There would be an ovi trap on the top. That's the reservoir of water that the mosquitoes would lay their eggs in. Then there would be a drain that's connected to an automatic valve, a filter, and then a reservoir below for the water to collect. So every 7 to 10 days, based on the temperature, the valve would open, the system would drain, and it would run all of the contaminants within the ovitrap through a filter, which would trap the larvae that were swimming around in the water. And there's a pump that would rinse the ovitrap a little bit, and then it would close the valve and then pump the solution back into the ovitrap. So what that does, it takes all the wonderful juice that has the food for the larva, it has the bacteria that are giving off carbon dioxide, and it has the pheromones that the eggs released when the larva hatched, and it puts it back into the ovitrap with no larva in it. So as you do that, a mosquito comes and lays its eggs, they hatch, it's filtered over and over and over again. But I find that the manual system is the way to go because it's just so cheap. And if you find that, let's say you have a remote property where you're not going to be able to be there for 3-4 weeks, either have a 5-gallon pail that has a lid and pour the filtered solution into that, store it, put it back out in a couple weeks when you're back, or just dump it out and start over again. Just don't leave it. If you have any doubts whether you're going to be able to be back to your property, dump them out. So one of the things that I recommend that you do with the traps is after you've put them out, just before you actually filter them, take a look and see how many egg grafts are in them. You'll find that some areas of your property could have upwards of 30 egg grafts. Those are the areas where you definitely want to have your trap. Other areas may only have 1 or 2 and they're not really doing anything at all. So feel free to move them around, usually on the edges of open areas, like sort of slightly overhanging of bushes and trees, because it tends to be calmer wind there. And that's also the area where they're likely to be finding their meals, which are going to be birds, rodents, other wildlife. The more traps you have, the better it's going to work. I wouldn't necessarily have one every 10 feet. Generally speaking, we found that it works perfectly fine to have one every 50 or 100 feet around the perimeter of the area that you're treating. It's also okay to have more at first and then decrease them with time. So I did the traps a couple days ago, so I figured I'd take a look and see how things are doing. So it looks gross and scummy because, well, it is gross and scummy. That's exactly what you want. And I'm looking. Can't say I see any eggs yet. But that's not a big surprise. Usually it takes a few days. We'll take a look at the other one. This one, however, that right there is a raft of mosquito eggs. So we've already had our first customer, and only gets better from here. All right, we're day 4, and we've got one raft there, and one there, small one there, got another one there. That might be the one that was here last time. So there's 4. Looks like there's, well, maybe 5. You can really sort of see them because you can see the dip in the surface tension, because they're sort of sitting there on top of the water waiting for the eggs to hatch. So like I said, it's really important that you filter this stuff, but it's got to be quick and easy to do, otherwise you're not going to want to do it. Unfortunately for me, I didn't actually have any pool filters left from the last time I built a system. So I've ordered those, and next week I'm going to build a filtration system to go along with the traps. So if you want to see that, make sure that you're subscribed, and that'll be next week. But this week, in order to make do, I tried a couple things. The first thing was the geotextile fabric that I used on the road, which you'll see in a minute. But it was woven and not very permeable, and so it didn't work at all. Then I tried using some shop towels draped over a 5-gallon pail. And it did work, but because there was so little surface area, it really clogged up easily with the goo that's in the water, and it was really super slow to filter. But in the end, it did do the job, and it'll be good enough for this week. One of the things that I definitely need to have is some shade here. The sea cans and the sheds turn into small ovens as soon as the sun comes out. And it was a hot day, and I thought, well, if I'm going to do anything, I should make me some shade. So the goal was to create some way to support a tarp on high, so that way I could create a shaded area that I could go and sit in. I took some rope that I got from a store that had gone out of business. so it was like super cheap, only a couple bucks, and wrapped it around a poplar across the driveway from the sea cans, 100-foot of rope, and tied it off to the sea can on one corner, around the tree, tied it to the next sea can. So that way I would have two ropes that were fairly far apart so I could string a tarp between them. And my goal was to put up an opaque tarp. I've got several of them. I can't find the smaller one that's somewhere in the shed. It doesn't matter. I thought to myself, well, I'll just put up one of the white tarps that I had. And it was really fussy getting it up there. I had run another rope across to try and support it a little bit so that way it wouldn't completely drape in between. But at the end of it, it basically did nothing. And I sat down underneath it with a popsicle and realized that this isn't going to work.
Well, that worked for almost no shade. It's so hot.
At least not today. My goal was to have something that was temporary, so I would only have it up when I needed the cover, because I don't want to try and support rainwater or anything like that. I didn't think it would go very well. In my heat-induced confusion, I was trying to tie it off and it wasn't doing any good, but I was too hot and I didn't want to make it any worse because I could already recognize the heat stroke starting to set in. So I just crumpled it up and hoped for the best. Well, while I was gone, we got in a huge amount of rain, and sure enough, it filled with water and lowered itself to the ground. Well, that didn't go as planned. But in hindsight, not a big deal. I can use that water for filling the mosquito traps. A couple days later, after the temperature dropped, I went to Princess Auto and got myself a couple tarps that were the right tarps. They were on sale, so why not? And came back. And instead of trying to rely on ropes alone, I put a couple of notches with a hole saw on the end of a 2x4. And put that between the ropes so that way it would hold the ropes apart and give me a pseudo consistent width. And then put the tarps across and it worked. When I first put in the driveway, I got several dump truck loads of gravel that I put into the beginning of the driveway to smooth it out. And there was a lot of excess that I wasn't easily able to scrape up with either the excavator or the backhoe, just because the way the rock is and where it's sitting. So I hand bombed it by shoveling into some buckets and then driving it to where it needs to be. Where I originally put the drainage in along the driveway to let the water out has been working perfectly fine. We've got some pretty serious rain. Earlier in the week we had almost 5.5 inches of rain, which is absolutely crazy for this area. But no rain stayed in the driveway. So to start, I'm just putting gravel on one side. So that way I can see once we get some more rain, make sure that it's still flowing the way that I expect it to, and then I can fill in the other side. I also put some geotextile under it to make sure that the rock doesn't just sink into the muck and spreads the weight of the truck a little bit as I go over it. So one of the big problems that I had this week is the heat. It's becoming a theme. I need to do something about it. I don't want to be running the truck in its AC all the time. So I have to have somewhere where I can cool off. I need to have a means that isn't just sweat and breeze. So I bought a couple of different kinds of cooling vest. One's an evaporative vest and the other one is a phase change material, but I just got them yesterday and I can't say that I'm super keen on what they used. I mean, it's all in Chinese, so you can't even really tell what it is, but from my research, it should be okay, but I'd rather use something that I understand better. So next week's video, I'm going to create those phase change materials and try them out, see how they work. And obviously, more things to do. I'm submitting the building permit this afternoon, and hopefully within a couple weeks, I'm gonna start building. So for all of that, hope you enjoyed the video. Like, subscribe, ring the bell, and all that good stuff. And we'll see you again next week. Have a good one. Deer flies piss me off. So as I said, that... Jesus Christ. Frog. These little buggers, they piss me off.